Mr. Stephen Morris of Pennyweight Wines in Beechworth. What a day it's been. Um, so, a lot's happened on your end. A lot's happened on my end. I found out so much about you that I didn't know before this conversation. You're a tech guru. You can fix computers, but you're also a member of an illustrious Royal Australian winemaking family. Super quickly, before we dive into the details, how are you, Stephen?
Hi, Tom. How are
I'm
you?
I'm very well, and I'm very happy to be having a chat with you. It wasn't all that long ago. I was down having a wonderful time in Beechworth, and I got the tour of a lifetime of Pennyweight from your good self, and I got to go along and as I think I mentioned to you before, I irritated Stephen Jr. Well, he was doing a little bit of barrel work. I went in there and got to see what he was doing and asked him a lot of questions. And he seemed like he was very focused. But that was such a wonderful day going around, and you were showing me the ins and outs. And we talked a little bit about stem contact and your winemaking philosophy. So you've been very busy at Pennyweight. Was it sort of some late picking? I understand.
Oh, no, we were pretty much in full swing at vintage, so yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, no, you've been busy. Well, look, I want to start by this might be a good place to start. So this is a bottle I've got here. It's an empty bottle, which is a good sign of your 2023 Beechworth Gamay, and this raises so many things that I want to talk to you about. I mean, it shows your biodynamic approach to winemaking. It raises a lot of questions about your varietals, your variety selection. A lot of questions about Beechworth because this wine was absolutely stunning. It was powerful. It was perfumed. It was, it's 12% alcohol, so it's not heavy. Very, very complex, but just so easy to drink. Talk to me a little bit about the Gamay.
Right. Well, the story goes back a bit because my wife had lived in Elizabeth had lived in Italy and Greece, and she was used to wines that you could drink any time, virtually of the day, and they were not heavy, not alcoholic. And this is back in the 60s. And so she'd always liked that style of wine. And most Australian wines in those days were pretty big and heavy and alcoholic. So she put a fair bit of pressure on me when we started making wine to produce a wine of that style. And I tried doing it out of Shiraz, and it didn't. It worked to a degree, but it wasn't. It wasn't right. We could lower the alcohol, but you couldn't get the lightness of structure and so on. And Barry Morey started using Gamay at Sorenberg, and with that with that variety, I thought this could be an answer to what we're, we're requiring. As an aside, Barry produces a much bigger style. It's a serious wine for him. For us, it's about just a lovely drink. So over the years, we've sort of developed that style, and of course, Stephen, as you pointed out, our son, is fairly focused on what he's doing, and well, not fairly, very focused on what he's doing, and he's refined the the style of the wine even more, and that's been a great thing, really. Yeah,
I want to ask you
how's that?
specifically about that's beautiful. I want to ask you about the biodynamic nature of what you're doing because it's a very specific philosophy I think to embrace when making wine, and
Yeah,
um, a lot of people will sort of take it from a philosophical perspective, but it also seems to, depending on how you approach it, have very real impacts on the end result being the wine. So when you, and that seems to be something that you tout and you talk about quite readily, you know, your lack of or no irrigation and the biodynamic approach to wine making. What result do you see that having on something like this or the other wines that you make? Can you taste, or are there certain things that you, certain consequences that that has on the wine?
I think, you know, without a doubt, it's quite an interesting little well, I think it's an interesting little story because when we started off here in Beechworth, we were just naturally went organic because that was basically how my father, grandfather, great grandfather made wine. So they didn't have the chemicals, they weren't invented, so it wasn't a matter of using them. So we said right from the word go, we wouldn't go down the chemical path. And I'd always been interested in biodynamics, but I always felt that it was, well, pretty mystical, you could say. And anyway, after many years of organic, I always felt there was something missing. It was a little bit about not doing things, whereas biodynamics, particularly, we found the preparation 500 and the prepared 500 a wonderful input into soil health. So we went down this track, and I was amazed to see the change in the vineyard, the change in the soil, the vines. But it was the change in the wines was the subtle, unexpected thing that we've found, and so it's a deepening of the fruit that I find that middle palate particularly is where you'll see the biodynamics coming to the fore. It's the driving of the fruit flavours that's quite a wonderful thing. I mean, there's probably a lot of other subtleties too, but that middle palate's pretty important in our style of wine. And biodynamics has been wonderful for that.
And when you say biodynamics, and let's just clarify, can you give some examples of the sort of measures and steps that you implement that result in you calling it biodynamic? Because I can think of, you know, certain other producers I'm aware of or who I've spoken to in the past that will do things like harvest according to the phases of the moon and plant manure and cow horns and all this sort of groovy stuff. So when you say biodynamic, and also distinguishing that from sustainable, generally speaking, organic, what do you mean when you say biodynamic?
What I mean is that it's all the things that organic is. So, you know, no chemicals and that type of thing. But then you move on to a much more positive approach in that it's hugely about soil health, really, and one of the main drivers is the preparation 500, which is made from putting cow manure and cow horns, bearing it over the winter, and then in the spring you lift the cow horns and spray out a very small amount of that, stirred into warm water for an hour. And I can't say that I wouldn't say that I fully understand it. I only see the results, but it's definitely tied up in some way with microbiology biology. Barry and I tried burying we buried a cow horn and some cow horns to make our own, but we use our association where the association does, makes the 500 each year and distributes to the growers. There are a lot of practices that we can, other things we can do, as you say, picking, racking and so on. But the Demeter organisation, as I see it, is primarily a practical thing. So you look at your options, but you've got to match up so many things, as in all farming, to get a result. And a good example of it is that there are times when you wouldn't put out 500, and we have a calendar and it shows us the different phases of what's going on and so on. But it's no good saying the calendar says it's right, but it's bone dry in the vineyard. So you've got to match everything up. You leave it too long waiting for the perfect, and then you're into the cold, and it's too cold to put it out. So one of the ways we get round that a bit is that putting it out once a year would be enough, but we aim to put that twice in the spring and the autumn, and hopefully one of those will work out, well for the result. So you've got, as in probably most aspects of winemaking and everything else, you've got the ideal, and then you've got to make a practical, pragmatic decision for each thing that you do. So that's basically my take on our approach to it.
That's very interesting, and I really liked what you said in terms of it's based fundamentally in microbiology. A lot of people will hear some initial sort of sneak peeks about it and they go, oh, that's really weird. That kind of sounds like a pseudoscience. But the people who I've spoken to that engage in the practice, they go, I don't quite understand it, but you look at the results. And I've tasted, I was just lucky enough the other day to enjoy with some other people who also very much enjoyed it, the 23 Gamay, and I've tasted... I think I've tasted some of your Cabernet blends. I don't recall if I tasted your Pinot Noir, but there were some of your whites as well and your fortified wines. And holy smoke, this might be actually before we kind of zoom in on Pennyweight and a little bit about yourself being a Morris and the illustrious Morris line. Let's just talk about Beechworth, because Beechworth, it's one of the crown jewels in Australia's winemaking crown, and it doesn't necessarily have the commercial underpinnings of what you might think of in terms of, some of the South Australian regions or even the Yarra Valley. But I just worked down this list that I've just put together, and you look at, you've got yourself, Stephen and Elizabeth Morris, and Stephen Jr. and Danielle that was so helpful in putting this conversation together. You've got Sorenberg, you've got Julian Castagna. We can't not mention Rick Kinsbrunner, Gioconda, Sabater. So these are all names that anybody who knows anything about Australian wine, they go, wow, they're all, A+, incredible wine. Yeah, just the image associated is par excellence. They're all Beechworth. So what is going on in Beechworth? Can you shed a little bit of light on what makes Beechworth such a special region?
Well, it's definitely a climatic aspect to it. When when we were looking for a place to set up in the northeast, Beechworth definitely came up as a possible suitable place. But back in '77, things were well. I wasn't aware of any wine being made in Beechworth. I can't remember Smith's at the instigation of young John Brown getting. He suggested that Peter Smith should plant some vines, and they'd take the fruit and try it out and see how it went. And that was, a similar period. Richard Smart, quite a famous viticulturalist of the period, he talked about Beechworth being a homocline for Bordeaux, and I thought, oh, that's it's sort of what we're thinking about. So we couldn't find anything in '77 when we moved here, so we had a block in town, and I thought, well, the first thing is to see how grapes grow in Beechworth. So I planted about 100 nearly 150 vines in this house block in town, and they were everywhere, in fact, and made a bit of wine, and it was really encouraging because whenever you go to an area that used to have vines and they disappear, you wonder what happened, why that disappeared, and probably was the cold period we went through in the 30s. I think that had a big effect on all the cool climates in Australia. It was that very cold period. So anyway, it showed up promisingly. Then eventually we found a current block which ticked the main boxes that I was looking for: red soil, sloping to the north or east, and so on. So then we could get started in '82 with our plantings. But going on to why Beechworth, it is a good place to grow grapes. It's in that cooler style. This is probably a bit controversial to say.
This is the place to say it if it's controversial. Go on. What are you going to say?
We've been very fortunate because it hasn't lent itself to large-scale wine production. And because of the good things that Rick Ginsburg and Barry Morey have done over the years, it's attracted people who are really interested in quality. And I think that, and the fact that it hasn't really attracted the big boys. So it's, the region's operated on the basis of small operations aiming for absolute quality. Well, there is no choice because you have to aim for quality. It's no good aiming for a price point down the market and put out the volume because you can't produce the volume here. So that's led, I think, to an enhancing of the region's reputation.
Yeah, no, absolutely remarkable. And you were talking about a little bit of history there, and I want to see how far back we can actually go. Just a little bit of, if we were to call it Beechworth for the uneducated idiots, because there may be a lot of people who, let's say in overseas markets, that aren't entirely familiar with what's going on. So I take the word idiot back. Let's just call them unaware, uneducated. But you go back to, almost the 1800s, and the historical significance of, Beechworth, and you got Yakadanda, which is so fun to say. That's a little bit to that's almost like 20 minutes to the east, I think, just towards the coast.
Yeah.
And you got Myrtleford south, you got Rutherglen and Albury slightly northwest, not far. I've got a lot of family in Albury, so that's why I'm so fascinated by this region. But gold. So gold, there was a gold rush between the sort of 1800s, 1850 plus or minus, and so is that sort of the start of the story of these little regions? How much light can you shed on that?
Well, I think gold was around about 1852 in Beechworth. And because there had been other finds around Victoria at the time, as soon as a new strike, people came in their droves. So there was a big increase in population in the area through, I'm not sure exactly, it didn't just stop, it probably just petered out over the next 50 years or so. But it's actually quite interesting, I think, that old gold mining areas are often associated with vineyards in Australia. Anyway, it's part of why people had to be fed was that there were quite a lot of table grapes planted to feed people in Beechworth, and then of course there were wineries in Beechworth, and as you say, Yakandanda and Rutherglen and so on. So it was, yes, it certainly got some history there.
It's so beautiful.
I think the last.
I mean, anybody who hasn't had the opportunity to visit Beechworth or Yakandanda, I'd go spend a week plus there, and it's what, like, I feel silly saying this as a, somebody of my generation, but I go, that's how I imagine it being. It's a sort of a timestamp back in time. You're stepping into just these bygone days and these beautiful little towns, and it's like one lane and there's a couple of stores and everybody seems to know everybody, and it's just drop dead gorgeous. It's literally stepping back in time, and Ned Kelly and is it Harry Power, the Bushrangers, and so. You've got the
Yes.
gold history, but that gave rise to so many other things. You've got, the bushranger history of Australia and the development of these little colonies. So it's just fascinating.
Yes, well, you can. It's not hard to imagine it when you walk around because of the setting and the old buildings, and there's a lot of information there. I would say to people, when you come to Beechworth, you certainly need a week. And if you're going out to the wider region, you probably need 2 weeks. But you can do as much or as little as you like. It's all there if you want to go out searching and doing things. But if you just want to perhaps sit by a fire in a pub or that's all there too. So it's but it does, the more time you spend, the more you discover. Mm-hmm. And that's true with the wineries as well.
Yeah. Now, can you speak to you're talking about the association between gold mining areas, traditional gold mining areas, and vineyards, and that's very interesting. That would sort of maybe put a question mark over what's going on in the soil composition. And I know that can be such a annoying, lame question to ask because soil composition is extremely complicated and can differ literally meter by meter, let alone over larger areas. But is there anything to your mind that makes Beechworth soil composition unique that would sort of lend to the quality of the wines or the vines that are being grown?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. One of the things Beechworth Vineyards Association did at one stage was have a map of all the soil types and an overlay of where the vineyards are. And I think the diversity of soil types is a huge contributing factor to the interest of the wines, because there's a big range of soil types that the vineyards are on. I don't. There's also the complication of the miners were hard workers and they moved a lot of soil around, and it's incredible how they disrupted the landscape. So that, is an extra complication. One of the things when you're talking about the soil that crosses my mind is that when I was growing up, the general view in Australia was that, which come from France, was that it was all about soil type. And then Andrew Perry in Tasmania did work on the effect of climate on quality. And so he did his doctorate on that. And he started to thinking that it was all about climate. And that went on for a long, long time. But I suspect that it's actually about both those parameters, and that you will have variations according to the soil, variations on the general climate, and then, of course, the microclimate of each vineyard. And the microclimate's quite significant because you'll have ripening according to altitude, but you'll also have it according to microclimate. Sort of getting pretty complicated when you think about it.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I don't know whether that answers your question. I think it's raised more questions than answers.
But doesn't wine and any good thing ultimately end up doing just that? Just to paint or to see if we can complete just a bit of a generalised picture of Beechworth for those that may not be as familiar with it. And it's always dangerous painting a generalised picture. But you mentioned it's cool climate. So I think during the growing season, little bit of research I've done, you'd have sort of a mean temperature of 20 plus or minus degrees Celsius. So that's quite cool, if that is correct.
I have no idea.
No idea. Do what works. In terms of altitude, it's quite varied. So we're in the heart of Victoria's high country. And so that sort of ranges from 200 metres up to beyond 1,000 metres. And so you can get some real altitude, and that totally impacts climate, the temperature, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, yeah, that's right. It's and that's another factor. You're quite right, because the region goes down to Everton, and I can't remember what their altitude is, but it's a long way down. And then it goes up to Beechworth, but then out to Stanley. And there's some really interesting things happening out at Stanley. It particularly is good at the moment, the way the climate's sitting. It's so, there's, obviously Pinot and Chardonnay and so on are showing up very well out there as the really cool climate. So it's lovely to have that diversity in the altitudes as well as the soils and so on. Yeah.
Yep. And in terms of varieties, Beechworth, I mean, what does it not do well? I just mentioned a few before, ranging from, fortifieds to Beechworth Chardonnay has made an international name for itself. I've just been lamenting that I'm out of what was in this bottle, the 23 Gamay. That was just nectar of the gods. Pinot Noir, Cabernet blends. So I guess with such complicated terrain, you can do so many different things well. But do you have an opinion on what varieties really capture the essence of Beechworth and why?
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. You see, one of the things when we were starting out, we didn't know what was going to grow in Beechworth, what was going to do well, and so on. So there was a reasonably wide, even amongst the early plantings, but certainly, Cabernet blend styles. But that was also because Cabernet was fashionable in that period. Chardonnay, we planted Riesling, Pinot. I put some port varieties in. I can tell you one thing that doesn't do well in Beechworth, and that's muscat. That needs to come from Rutherglen.
That's why you're.
I shouldn't say that because Brown's actually had a vineyard at Everton back in the 50s, and the muscat from there was good, and so was a lot of the sherry material. But that's we planted. Most of our early plantings was Palomino because I wanted to do things with sherry, and it's quite different to Palomino grown in Rutherglen, but it's worked out well for Fino. Has good acidity. Could be a little bit prone to getting a bit more fruit flavour than you want, but it's good. So I think certainly initially it was all about the French varieties, Bordeaux, Burgundy, and a bit of Alsace. But in more recent times, and I'm not one to be able to talk on this subject because we don't have any Italian varieties, but they certainly are being grown, and probably Nebbiolo is the one that people are working hard to aim for that top niche style. So that's happening. Mark Walpole's just planted a new variety out at Stanley that I'd never heard of. And that's going to be very interesting. So, and again, this is the type of thing that small operators can play around with this sort of thing and make small quantities of different wines and see how they go.
And yet you mentioned Mark Walpole, and I've had a couple of his wines, and it just goes back to what I find so fascinating is the ability to coax flavour in such a balanced way. It's not clumsy extraction of flavor. It's incredibly balanced, incredibly structured in terms of, acid profile and all that, the scaffolding to hold it together. But oh my gosh, is it perfumed and flavoursome? And isn't that at the end of the day, that's what you want with the wine? So go Beechworth.
Absolutely, and I think I think that's where, particularly, I think the climate comes in. That if if grapes can ripen with the balance there, you you're really a long way down the winemaking track. But if they ripen sugar ahead or behind and out of balance, then you'd have to be a magician to make great wine from that. So we are fortunate. If long as the climate stays around about where it is, it'll be good for a long time to come.
Yeah. What I say, great wines are made in the vineyard. It's an oldie but a goodie, and there must be some truth to it. Going back to something that you mentioned before, and this definitely fascinates me. You were talking about is that the Palomino that goes into the fortified, your sherry, and I know that's something that you're very passionate about. And just there's once again so much complexity that we could tie ourselves in knots here talking about. Is just in the treatment of grapes that are sort of earmarked for fortified versus grapes that are going to go on and make more traditional table wines. The treatment of those, is it different, bearing in mind what they're going to end up being used for?
No, if you, I mean, fortifieds is as broad and complex as table wine.
Yep.
So we'll just talk about the Palomino and floor sherry production. We probably shouldn't be using the word sherry in public, but old habits die. So basically what you're looking for from the Palomino is a fairly neutral fruit flavour, but flavour just the same. So it's got to have. It's not water. It's still got a lot of flavour, but not the fruity style flavour that you might get from muscat or something else. So and we then try and make a delicate dry white. So very low tannin sort of structure, low extraction. And we usually do that by only taking the free run that comes from crushing into the basket. That will go to the vino. The pressings we'll fortify up, and that'll go to a white sweet fortified. So that's the first stage of the process. And then, of course, we could go on and talk about floor and all sorts of things. But I sometimes look at the wine, because we go through and look at all the wines before it goes on to the process and choose where they're going to go and what's going to happen to them. And the Palomino from up here, we could make a pretty good dry white out of it at times. It's and that's sort of what we're aiming for is good quality in a delicate style, not in your orange wine style. I've lost the thread of the question.
Very good. There was a lot there. Look, what I would like to talk to you about now is, I mean, there's two different ways to go. I think we'll end up in the same place. So let's start at the very beginning. the Morris family. I mean, that is one of the most illustrious names in Australian wine. The Morrises of Rutherglen, Morrises in Beechworth. There is so much meaning, so much history and legacy that family brings to Australian wine. So, can you just give a little bit of a history of the Morris family, and then maybe talk a little bit about the bifurcation of how you came to what you sort of have mentioned when you came to set up in Beechworth, but a little bit about the inception of Pennyweight as a project.
Okay. Well, I don't think any of us are particularly flash or illustrious, as you say, but the family's been doing it for a long time. And sometimes I think if you keep doing, you stick to something for a long period, a certain amount can be achieved. The family started in the wine business when my great-grandfather came to Beechworth, actually, looking for gold. Just haven't got the year, but I've got 54 in my mind, but I can't be sure. I've forgotten now. I could have done some preparation for this if I'd known what your question was going to be. Anyway, he started off and he was in the Buckland field and got very ill, and he came back to Beechworth and he was recovering there, and he started to realise that there were other ways of making his fortune without digging for gold. And his family were sort of like merchants in Bristol and Liverpool over a period. And so he had some commercial experience, we think. Anyway, he could see there was a chap already set up in Beechworth. Scott was his name, and he went into partnership with Scott, and they built up a very big business supplying the miners, and they also, part of it was a bakery and so on, and then they had centres around the other gold fields of the area, and I think after a very short period, it might have been 4 years, he sold his share and it made enough money to retire. So he did the grand tour, and his mother-in-law had financed his trip out, so he sent for the daughter, and she came out and they married. So they went back with, they'd already had some kids by then, including, I think, my grandfather. Anyway, they did the grand tour of Europe, came back, and he bought land at Rutherglen, and we was going to breed hunters as a retirement project. This is family passed down sort of stuff, so how accurate it all is, I don't know.
Really good story.
He certainly owned the land, and he certainly was doing all these things. But as part of it, I planted an orchard, and I did general farming, and he planted vines. And by that stage, my grandfather was getting involved, and between the two of them, they eventually built up the biggest winery in the Southern Hemisphere on this site. And I find it quite interesting because my grandfather he was the winemaker for this very large operation, and as part of one of his trips to Europe, he went to see Pasteur, because Pasteur was starting to talk about how grape juice gets converted to wine, and so they were all through that period they were making wine and knew nothing about yeast.
That's remarkable.
And when you think that, yeah, it's pretty interesting, I think, because and no wonder they thought it was pretty magic, and it's sort of, in some ways we've lost a bit of the magic because we now think, oh, it's all about yeast and it's about this. Anyway, he got to be careful, I'll really lose my train of thought. But anyway, that experience of seeing Pasteur and learning a bit about this was another step in the progress of his winemaking abilities. And as with families, eventually there was a falling out between my great-grandfather and my grandfather. And so my grandfather went down the road and started what's now known as Morris Wines in Rutherglen, and that's a couple of miles away. And eventually the Fairfield place, the original place, was sold, and it within about probably 25, 30 years, it had gone out of business and disappeared. And whereas my grandfather, although he was short of finances, he built a good, solid business based on mostly by local trade. He did do some export, whereas the original place was very much on export to the colonies and the mother country. And so from there, my father and his two brothers carried on the Morris Wines. They went through a pretty tough time, depression, the Second World War. Uncle Chas kept the winery going, short of manpower, but in order to do it he had to cut a fair few corners. So when my cousin Mick came back after he was at Rosebery during the war, and after the war he came home and he had a lot of work fixing the vineyard up because of the neglect and so on. And then in the 50s, I remember my father saying we wouldn't stay in business if it wasn't for the sheep. So things were tough. But then, of course, came the red wine boom of the 60s and then the white wine boom. But again, we've moved into the we've moved into the third and the fourth generations, and family businesses get pretty complicated at that point. So then that's when the family sold Morris Wines, and part of it I wasn't interested in. I worked at home until I could earn enough money to go away, and I went to Queensland. And
it's a good place to be, Queensland.
Yeah, pretty good. It's pretty good, but not good for. Oh, no, I won't say that. But it's not. We'll move on, and so and then eventually my father died, and by that time I'd had a try of farming, and I thought, this has got whiskers on it. You send your produce off and take whatever people decide to give you, and I saw the collapse of the cattle business where they became worthless, and And I thought, this is just crazy. This is not the way to live your life on that basis. My father didn't put up with any of that nonsense. And it just kept coming out. And by this time I was married, and Elizabeth was a great supporter of having a go, even though financially it was an impossibility. And so we came to look for a site and where to settle, and it's, as I said, about Beechworth being a good place to do that. And, well, that's sort of... Well, just on that, although my father had died, it was very interesting to me, starting off making wine and going to Charles Sturt to study viticulture, and then a bit of wine science degree. All the time I kept hearing all these things that Dad would say to me, about this, about casks. It's very interesting how much you take on as a kid growing up in an environment where all this is happening. And he never once sort of even, I don't think he ever really encouraged me to go into the wine industry, but he imparted a lot of knowledge. So it's that's been quite an interesting thing, and things still come up today, and I'll think, oh yeah, he was talking about that,
Yeah. So many questions come up from that fascinating history you just gave me, and just based on what you most immediately said, do you think you look back at that whole experience that you would have grown up with and listening to your father and these things you sort of absorbed? Hang on, sorry, I just completely I just lost track of myself. I'm gonna ask you something else, and you may not be able to answer this question, but you mentioned the Morris family going through World War II, and that would have been a very difficult time for the family for a bunch of different reasons. Difficult time for industry, shortage of labour. What did wineries do when everybody was away at war? Like, there's a lot of government coming in and taking over industries and appropriating them towards war efforts. Do you have any knowledge of how the wine industry was sort of interwoven with the whole war atmosphere at that time, or was it just keep on keeping on?
Oh no, it very much changed. I mean, if we go back to the First World War, my father's two brothers went to the First World War, and Uncle Chas was 18 and Uncle Gerald was 17, and that must have been extremely difficult for my grandfather and grandmother to have those young men in that situation. And they were both lucky enough to survive. They weren't unscathed, but they survived. But moving to the Second World War, one of the things that we did slightly raise the concept of not irrigating, and of course none of the vineyards were irrigated in those times, so that relied on cultivation as part of the process of weed control and retaining moisture and so on. But according to my father, Uncle Chas used to just get the horses would go out into the vineyard with discs on and just go up and down the roads, whereas the proper way to do it would have been to have moldboarded, to have cleaned up around each vine, and then later thrown back and whole host of procedures that were required to be done for a thorough job. But they had to cut the corners because there were big shortage of manpower. They didn't have tractors. I'm not sure when they got the first tractor, but it could have been towards the end of the war. A farm hall, I remember the farm hall. Anyway, that certainly had an impact, and they also pegged prices through the war, so everything was fixed. And Dad said it was the only period they actually made a profit because they had they had very low costs because they couldn't pay the wages because there's no one to employ, and the price was set so there was no discounting or anything like that. So it wasn't all bad. So that was one of the impacts. Of course, there was an incredible shortage of building materials, and I remember we had a sherry house. You know, it was a tin shed built for storing aging sherries, and it was made of rolled, corrugated iron, but it wasn't galvanised. So, of course, it all went rusty and eventually holes in it because you couldn't buy galvanised corrugated iron. Another little aside to that, I don't know why we're talking about this, but anyway.
Interesting. That's right.
Another thing is that quite a few of the old wineries that went out of business during the Depression and into the Second World War period, their buildings were demolished to get materials for building things after the war because, restrictions and what do they call it, where you can't buy things, rationing went on for quite a few years after the war. So it had quite a big impact. It was also, I don't quite know why the wine industry became so small through that period. In the 50s, there was, probably even into the early 60s, there was only about, I don't know, maybe 14 vineyards in Victoria. So it really, and there was a huge number in, say, the 1880s, 1890s. So you could say it's a bit cyclic, based on that.
Yeah. What isn't cyclic? Now, you mentioned that you took you could almost call it a sabbatical from the wine industry and you went north into Queensland. Now, I could get in trouble for asking this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I think you sort of wove in there that was about the time, or the place even, that you met Elizabeth. Is that correct? How did that unfold?
Yes, that's
Yeah, tell me
right.
about that.
Yes, it is. Yes, I used to come home, probably once a year and, spend a bit of time and meet up. And yes, that's right. I don't know. I'm trying to think when we met, probably 67, 68, something like that. And but I think it was 67, and so we didn't get married for 10 years, so it was a pretty distant relationship. No, not distance, that's not a good term. It's long distance relationship. I mean, there's absolutely not a shadow of a doubt in my mind there would be no Pennyweight Winery if it wasn't for Elizabeth. She is, she just never once said, we're not going to buy a barrel, we're not going to buy a trailer, we're not going to buy a tractor. Always the winery come first with her. She was absolutely behind the project right through, and it required that to get it up there. You couldn't do it otherwise, and and she's still very passionate about it. So it's been a. And then, of course, we've been very fortunate with our three sons who have all worked in the business since they could. If they were too small when we were planting, we put them in a hole. But when they could crawl out of the hole, they could start planting. So it's it's been quite extraordinary, really.
Yep.
A journey.
And
Yeah.
you mentioned three sons, whereas Stephen Jr. is the head winemaker. So what of the other two? Where'd they disappear to?
Well, Charles, when he could, after he finished university, he went off and has really always been working in the computer sort of side of things. And so even though he's still in Beechworth, he hasn't continued down the track, but he did a lot of work. Used to mine cellar door when he was a kid and all that stuff. Not allowed to do that now, but he did it and did a good job. They used to get into the vineyard and do things, pick grapes and, all that stuff. Stephen's, he had a period away. He's done quite a bit in the building industry. And Fred has probably worked the most in the wine industry, not always for us, but Fred was very interested in the wine industry, but he really felt that he couldn't handle the complexity of a wine business. And to most people, I think they think it's just about tasting wines and talking to people. But in actual fact, you're a full-blown farmer, so you're subject to all the vagaries of the weather and all the other problems that come with farming. Then you're involved in the wine-making process, which is sort of a bit like a secondary value-adding stage of the whole business. And then there's the marketing side as well. And you'd have to be stupid to take on those three altogether. If you took on one, that's acceptable, but three it's really hard. And so it didn't work for Fred. And he's in Rutherglen, has a small vineyard down there, and he's worked around some of the wineries in Rutherglen, and so we were very fortunate that Stephen was prepared to take it on, and he's I think his focus is allowing him to handle that complexity, and you've suffered a little bit from that because he said, "No, I can't do that." That's it. So you've only got me.
Oh, that is That is a focused winemaker in action. So that's exactly what we're talking
That's
about. I
right.
love it. Just based on what you said, you sort of drew three different segments, and you've got the marketing at one end and the winemaking down the other, farming. Of the three, this could be a very silly question, but I love asking silly questions. Which one do you think is the hardest? They're all hard for different reasons. But
Yes, yes. No, no. I know exactly what you're saying. There's no doubt that growing good fruit is the hardest. That's and it's also the key to the other two, because and again, it's my father coming out. He said it's not hard to sell good wine, and so he said, "You, that's the focus. You, you've got to have good grapes. You've got to look after them through the winery, and the next stage will look after itself." And to a fair degree, I think that's true. I mean, you've got to you've got to look after your customers and do all that sort of thing. You can't treat them too badly because, but if the product's good, that side of it will be okay. So it all comes back, and I know it's a sort of worn out phrase, that good wines are made in the vineyard, but there's not a shadow of a doubt that you can't make a good wine if you haven't got the grapes. It's that simple, I think. And but if I had to do one thing, it would be definitely I'd be in the vineyard. That's personal, but that's where I like to be. There's nothing like it. We've just finished picking grapes. I'm still picking, and I love it. I love being out there. If something happens, you get a hailstorm, I can't say I love being out there when picking rotten grapes. That's no fun for anyone. But it's just magic to. I hope I've got rid of that. It's really magic to be out there picking with a group of people. It's good fun. And to see those grapes coming in and knowing that the wine's going to be good is it's a wonderful thing.
yeah, that's a very, very interesting because, I mean, then you go to the marketing, and a gentleman I spoke to recently said something that I thought was very profound, which is he said you can take away all the cliches of having a complex marketing strategy and refine it down to what can you do that is really hard for your competitors to replicate. And so, if you sort of sift through the conversation that we've had, and this is where we maybe sort of tie it into what is Pennyweight all about, because you make phenomenal wines. You've got a
Sorry, someone's being very annoying. What can
That's
I
all right.
do? Put on flight mode. Put that to.
That might do it.
There you
You've
go.
got you've got phenomenal wines. You've got a phenomenal story, and that's very particular to you, the family, and it can sort of sound profane, but the brand, that's who you are, and you can go out to the market and you say this is very unique to us. Nobody else can really replicate that. It's very unique. So, if I can just ask, Pennyweight, where did that name come from? What's the story behind the name Pennyweight?
Well, the vineyard, as you are aware, is situated on a hill overlooking a flat towards the town, and the flat there was was called Pennyweight Flat, and that was on the maps before Beechworth was on a map. And pennyweight is actually a gold measure. There's 20 pennyweights to an ounce. And so we think the nuggets that were being found on the flat were probably not particularly big, so the pennyweight size probably instigated the name. But anyway, that was called Pennyweight Flat, and when we were setting up, we thought it'd be nice to have a name, and it just seemed to be the right thing because we were right on the edge of Pennyweight Flat. In fact, there's an old a dam was sited down on the flat from the sluicing days, and the whole thing filled up with silt, and it's formed the flat. So some of our soil has been affected by that, and there's also were mullock heaps from a deeper mines on some of the vineyard as well. So we've got true gold influence into the soil.
Beautiful. Yeah. You can taste it in the wines.
Yeah.
Gold leaf. Now, after, we go back about 10 minutes, and you said words to the effect of you have to be crazy to tackle the farming, the winemaking, and then the customer-facing marketing aspect of selling the beautiful product that you make. Looks like you've done it, and you've done it relatively successfully from, when was it? The early 1980s when you started Pennyweight, I think, around then
That's right.
Till today. Yep. We've got the next generation, Stephen, taking over. So can you just tell a little bit, that we might end with this because you've been very generous with your time, a little bit of the story from, the inception of Pennyweight and the highs and the lows and where it sits today?
Well, I don't know how to tackle that. We've basically been too busy to think about that. We just we've just sort of kept going. And Stephen's doing exactly the same thing. He's got so many things that he's trying to get done, and things he wants to try, and that you just keep doing it. But I suppose thinking about, you can edit a lot of this stuff out. So, significant points you get to in this process is getting the vines up to production, and that was a big job because I had different plans when I started to how I was going to do it and how I evolved through eventually to doing pretty much what we did at home, but I was trying more modern approaches and they weren't working because I was adamant we wouldn't irrigate. And I firmly believe that there's a reason why they ban irrigation in Europe. But so that took a while. It's a big thing when you produce your own wine from your own grapes and so on. But then the next thing is how, when you're getting started, how do you find your markets and so on? And probably initially we were just going to have a cellar door and that would be all we'd do. But then you start thinking, maybe we could go out around local trade. And so we started to do that and sold a bit in Beechworth and a bit around the place. And that was significant. And then we then thought maybe we would do something in Melbourne because we were getting some inquiries. And Elizabeth and I used to go down about every 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, and we'd go around and we still have a policy that we're finding it a bit difficult to do these days, but to know your customers, to be able to talk to them and find out what's going on and if they're happy and so on. So that was a significant step. And so it's been an evolution of this thing. People say to Elizabeth, who do you sell your wines to? And Elizabeth will always say, I don't sell my wines to people, they buy them. And that has been an evolution, and I believe that, again, it's part of the emphasis on, if you like, quality. I know you can throw quality around, but people seek the wines, and I firmly believe they seek them because they're good. And since COVID, we sort of got out of the way of going out, and it probably coincides as we're getting too old to go out, and we still, the business is still growing and so on, and new outlets find us and that sort of thing. So that's another stage, if you like. Danielle will be wonderful, but she's fairly preoccupied with 3 little kids at the moment.
She's a weapon. I mean, she's got 3 little kids, and she's answering my emails and my text messages. And
that's
doing
right.
A lot of things.
She's Danielle's, yeah, and she's got a lovely style about her, and she's already quite involved cellar door and trade work and stuff. But it is a challenge with 3 young kids. So it's just moved along, and it's been, I mean, it's quite extraordinary going to the next generation, because that's a difficult thing to face. That out. It's difficult for Stephen to have an annoying old man beside him all the time, and it's difficult for me to hold my tongue and so on. But we have our moments, and never lasts, and there's a lot of goodwill, and we're both trying. Probably we find each other both trying too, but that's how it is, and it's a nice thing to be able to do that, because it just would have folded if it hadn't gone to another generation.
That's so interesting. That's such an interesting last comment you made. And do you feel that you've got yourself, Stephen Senior, Stephen Junior, and there is inevitably going to be a little bit of tension maybe when you're working together, because you're both unique, you're both very gifted in your craft, but do you both feel, maybe I can't really ask Stephen Jr., but I can definitely ask you, are you sort of satisfied and at peace with the direction that you see Pennyweight going as a brand, as a business, as a winery? Is there sort of harmony in that motion between you and Stephen going forward?
Oh, absolutely. There's not a shadow of a doubt about that. I always say, that Stephen's a bit obsessive compulsive, And that's a wonderful trait for this stage of the business where it's there. And when he said, I want 3 new puncheons, French oak, French coopered, we can do it. So yes, we buy them. He's got them. You know, it's so he can be really focused. He can have ideals that he's adamant he's going to work to, and the business can do it. When I was starting, there was just no possibility of any of that sort of thing. So it's, I think he's the right man at the right time for this business. And also when looking around the winery, when I was looking after the wines, I had barrels all over the place, and sometimes I'd lose wines, and he has everything ordered and thorough. So he's doing what I was doing in a much better way.
Look, such a beautiful question to what could have been a slightly beautiful answer to a slightly provocative question. But look, Mr. Stephen Morris,
No,
it has been such a pleasure chatting with you. I'm so glad we got to do this, and I've really got to thank. It was my uncle, Mr. Peter Harper, who is a dentist in Albury for many years, and it was him. He introduced me to Pennyweight, and so I was down visiting one day, and he was talking about Pennyweight, and he said, "You got to go to Pennyweight. You got to go taste." And so I eventually got around to doing it sometime later, and I got to meet yourself. I got to meet Elizabeth in the cellar door. She has a wicked sense of humour. She's a fantastic lady. But look, I'm so glad that after all this time, we've managed to sit down here and have a chat and hear about the philosophy, the story, everything that makes Pennyweight what it is, including the very special family that forms part of that story. So look, I've had an absolute blast chatting with you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. A pleasure. And Elizabeth said to ask you how Peter was because we haven't seen him for a while.
Well, look, I can pass that on. Last time I checked, he was organising to ride a bicycle up a very long, steep mountain and then go on a multi-day hike and a road down the river after that. He's as active as he's ever been, but he's sort of one of the champions of Albury, and he's such an advocate for the wineries in not just Victorian Highland, but Rutherglen. I felt embarrassed when I went in to see the Campbells, and Uncle Peter was with me, and they go, "Peter Harper." I'm like, he's my uncle. Everybody knows him. It's ridiculous. So, no, I'll pass on his regards, but he loves your wines, and now I'm very grateful to say so do I. They're just phenomenal. So anybody listening, Pennyweight Wines, where it's at, Beechworth, it's a wonderful region, and Pennyweight is a very special winery in that region. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Mr. Stephen Morris of Pennyweight Wines is very confident in the future of what is a very special winery. Thank you so much again.
Bye.